Okay, please create a new notes page on the right side. Purpose is dates of the new country, and the date is 10/25. Notes will follow this structure. Uppercase A will have the date next to it, and then the details will be the lowercase letters. Some themes, you don't need to write this down, just watch and listen. First theme is political. The U.S. government is interested in expanding westward. And remember, political factors are anything that has to do with politics or government. And because the U.S. government's interested in moving westward, they begin to make laws that forcibly remove Native people from their traditional lands. 2, economic factors, anything that has to do with money. Well, the rise of cotton, there's an increased demand for cotton and products made out of cotton. Well, this increases the trading of enslaved people from the coastal South to planters in the deep South, so they can be there to pick cotton and meet the demand for cotton. And then 3, we have social factors, anything that has to do with people. Enslaved families are being torn apart by what is now called the Second Middle Passage, the movement of enslaved African Americans from the coastal South to the deep South. And Native people lose connection to ancestral lands, for they are being removed in order so the U.S. government can gather natural resources or raw materials from the lands that the Native people previously lived on, and white supremacy begins to grow. That means that is doctrine or the belief that whites are better than other races, and this was used to justify slavery. However, it's countered by abolitionism, or the movement to abolish or get rid of slavery. All right, our first date is 1783. And the Revolutionary War has come to an end, and you have the Treaty of Paris. And this is where the United Kingdom or Great Britain recognizes the United States as independence, and the U.S. takes control of territory east of the Mississippi River. We can see it here in green. This is the Mississippi River. East of that is now the United States. And B, B is political factor, and this is primarily a political factor because it establishes that the United States is now a sovereign nation, meaning it can determine its own path with its own laws. It doesn't depend on another country. Okay, next date, 1793. And cotton before 1793 was a low profit crop because it took a long time to pick and separate cotton from the seeds. It was labor intensive, so it didn't make much money. However, lowercase b, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin in 1793, which could process as much cotton in one day as 100 people. These people are using the cotton gin, which is right here. It separates the seed from the fluff. The cotton gin drove the price of cotton down, which increased demand. Now that cotton was cheap, there was a higher demand to make clothing, drapes, bedding, anything made out of cloth. And lowercase d, this also led to a greater demand for enslaved labor and land. Planters wanted more enslaved labor to pick the cotton in the fields that they now were gobbling up by the hundreds of acres, and land that they were taking from the native people. So, 1803, uppercase C. This is Louisiana Purchase. It was made in 1803 for $15 million, and the U.S. government was purchasing it from France. This is a political factor because the United States doubles in size and gains power because of doubling in size, and you have two nations making a business deal. One purchases land from the other. And C, it's economic because somebody paid for the land, the U.S. government, and there's a massive amount of resources that are acquired on this newly purchased land by the United States. Okay, 1807 is the ban on the trade of enslaved people, and this stops African importation of enslaved labor. So that means capturing and forcibly putting onto the Middle Passage enslaved Africans. Comes to an end. So lowercase b, this leads to something called the Second Middle Passage. Because Africans are not coming from the continent of Africa, well, now enslaved people are sold from the upper coastal South, these are African Americans, to the deep South. So now the trade becomes within the country itself. This is a political factor because a federal law is passed to end the importation of enslaved people. It's a social factor because there is early recognition of slavery being wrong. So the fact that they're making this law that ends the importation of enslaved Africans is an acknowledgement that maybe slavery is a moral evil. Not maybe, it is, but they're beginning to acknowledge that it is. And E, it's an economic factor, is essentially ends the slave trade and creates an internal trading of enslaved people within the United States. So already enslaved labor that exists in the coastal South is now being traded to the deep South, and this tears families apart. Uppercase E is 1812. This is the war leads America. So the War of 1812 leads America to seek economic independence from Britain. So now that they've had the Revolutionary War, about 30 years later, or 30 to 40 years later, you have the War of 1812, and now America no longer is going to be dependent on Britain for acquiring resources or creating business or trade partners. They're now going to do it on their own, and this leads to industrialization, but it also really leads to the United States really relying on cotton to make a lot of money, which has a trickle-down effect because it increases slavery, and it also increases the desire to take land from native people. B, political factor, wars between two countries and governments, so we have a political factor here. Okay, F is something called the Second Middle Passage. And lowercase a, with the ban on the importation of enslaved people and the invention of the cotton gin, the trade of enslaved people shifts or changes. Now, tobacco was no longer as profitable as it once was or had been. It was oversupplied and it depleted the soil of its nutrients. It was very taxing on the ground, tobacco was. So owners of enslaved people in the Upper South, that's Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, etc., start selling enslaved people to the Deep South, which is in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and they're there to work on the cotton plantations. And this map shows that in 1790, you have most enslaved labor in the Upper Coastal South, whereas by 1860, which is right on the doorstep of the Civil War, there still is slavery being practiced in the Upper Coastal South, but now you have movements throughout what is known as the Deep South, which is where my cursor is now. So, Second Middle Passage continued. D, enslaved people are transported hundreds of miles and sold into cotton plantations. So they're being forcibly removed from the coastal South and brought into the Deep South and sold, and that tears families apart. So families are split apart in the process. Okay, next date is 1830. This is called the Indian Removal Act, and they were treaties between the U.S. government and tribes, and there were several tribes, and the American Indians in the East could voluntarily trade their lands for new territory east of the Mississippi River. The key word here is voluntarily. That means they could stay if they wanted. The U.S. wanted land for Western European expansion west, and they wanted land in the South for more cotton production. And a lot of that land was being occupied by native people. So President Andrew Jackson disregards the treaty's voluntary policy, that they could choose to leave if they wanted. He said tribes choosing to stay would be forcibly removed to settlements west of the Mississippi River. As a result, 100,000 members of the civilized tribes, as they were called or nicknamed, mainly because they adapted some white ways. So the word civilized just basically means tribes that took on, because of pressure, white ways of living, are the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Cherokee, and the Creek. They were all forced west. 100,000 of them, 25% died during the various forced migrations. And you have something called the Trail of Tears. This is where 17,000 Cherokee were forced west from Georgia to Oklahoma Territory during the winter of 1838 and 1839. 4,000 Cherokee died during the Trail of Tears. This is particularly challenging because the Cherokee went to great lengths to adapt to white ways of living and to live within the confines set up by the U.S. government. So they tried to work with the U.S. government, but they were still forcibly removed by the thousands. And this shows some of the various migrations. The Seminole are moved into this Oklahoma territory. The Chickasaw and the Choctaw moved into this territory. You can see it's all during the 1830s. The Creek and the Cherokee are moved in the 1830s to these territories west of the Mississippi River, which would become Oklahoma. And 1830 continued. There is resistance, and there's something called the Seminole Wars, so that's down here in Florida. And in December of 1835, the Seminole resist forced removal with violence. This also happened in some tribes that existed in the Ohio River Valley, which is up here, where tribes put up a resistance and fought against the U.S. government because they did not want to move from their ancestral lands. Thank you for listening.